The footage you're seeing was taken by a police robot in the early 90s, and it's currently searching through a home looking for a man who just broke in after committing a series of unspeakable crimes. Despite being largely forgotten at time, this footage is still very much interesting, and thanks to the power of the internet, I was able to find out everything. So, I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstories first. Okay, so this entry has some of the most fascinating true crime footage I've ever seen, but it does take a little bit to get there because I have to give you background on the more serious events that happened leading up to it. And there's no footage of those parts, so it may not be as visually interesting in the beginning, but just bear with me, we'll get there. This story begins on October 13th of 1991 in the residential area of Little Neck in Queens, New York. The man at the center of our story, Andrew Brooks Jr., isn't too well documented, but we do know some things about him from those who were local to the area at that time. To those around him, Andrew Brooks was mostly a recluse and someone who was known to behave very oddly. He was 47 years old, unemployed, and living with his elderly parents. Some residents nicknamed him Crazy Andy or called him the Nut on the Block, describing him as someone who seemed unpredictable and made them feel uneasy, but nothing in his past suggested that he was actually dangerous or anything. He had no criminal record or history of violence. He was really just an oddball. His parents, who again he lived with, were 75-year-old Andrew Brooks Sr. and his mother Marion, also 75. And it seems this was their living arrangement for years without incident. Sadly, however, things were going to change in a really bad way. The morning of October 13th, 1991 began like countless others in this otherwise peaceful neighborhood, but before dawn broke, residents were startled awake by the sound of gunfire echoing through the quiet streets, prompting them to call the police. This is not an area where you would expect to hear this. And it turns out that inside and around the Brooks family residence, a horrific scene was unfolding. Over a series of days and seemingly out of nowhere, Andrew Brooks Jr. had armed himself with a rifle and systematically opened fire on several individuals that he brought to his parents' home, as well as his parents. This appeared to be happening without anyone noticing for a few days until this morning when those shots were heard. When police first arrived at the Brooks home, they found a scene of unimaginable carnage. In the backyard tool shed, officers discovered the bodies of Andrew Brooks Sr. and Brian Ducker, a neighbor who had been reported missing since the previous Thursday. Both men had suffered multiple gunshot wounds, and the condition of their remains suggested that they had been deceased for several days before being discovered. Inside the house itself, 2 more young men were found deceased from similar injuries. There was 23-year-old Daniel Gantovnik, who was found in the living room, and Michael Zarabi, whose age isn't known, who was found in another area of the home. Andrew's 75-year-old mother was also unfortunately later found, and this means that in and around the Brooks residence, police found 5 deceased people. Additionally, 2 other individuals managed to survive the assault, though their injuries were severe and life-threatening. Both survivors were rushed to area hospitals where medical teams worked frantically to save their lives, eventually making it through, but not without physical and psychological struggle. So in total, Andrew already had 7 victims, 5 deceased and 2 critical, and to make things worse, he was nowhere to be found, prompting a very serious manhunt to be launched. Detectives began their intensive search of the surrounding area, using specially trained dogs to detect any scent that might lead them to additional victims. And even though there was already 7, this was about to escalate even further. While authorities started searching and working to understand what had transpired at the Brooks residence, more calls came into law enforcement. Andrew Brooks Jr. had fled to a different community called Great Neck. There, this evil man selected a home at random and forced his way inside, taking 2 innocent residents hostage. Dr. Paul Gregory, a 71-year-old retired psychiatrist, and his wife Eva, who was 61, suddenly found themselves prisoners in their own home as Brooks positioned himself at a second-floor window with his rifle. He began firing sporadically at the ground below, at neighboring houses, and eventually at the growing number of police officers who were establishing a perimeter around the residence. And from this point forward, we do have footage of what happened. The tense standoff stretched through the entire day as heavily armed law enforcement officers surrounded the Gregory home. Brooks continued his intermittent shooting, sending police scrambling for cover and preventing any safe approach to the house. I also read that when a gardener arrived for work at a nearby property, Brooks fired in his direction, which forced him to flee for his life. I imagine this was before the police arrived, but man, poor gardener. Despite the dangerous situation, police negotiators did eventually manage to establish telephone contact with Brooks, and they noticed that he seemed relatively coherent during these early conversations. And as this October afternoon went on, negotiators achieved their first breakthrough when they successfully convinced Brooks to release Dr. Gregory around mid-morning. However, his wife Eva remained inside as Brooks continued at the window, maintaining his threatening posture with the rifle while she remained inside terrified. Many hours later though, at 5:40 p.m. and after being held captive for nearly 13 hours, Eva Gregory bolted for freedom when she saw that he was distracted, and we can even see footage of this. It really is kind of just sad to see this too. Police later observed that Brooks could easily have shot her during her escape but chose not to fire, suggesting some level of restraint or confusion on his part, but we don't really know. With both hostages now safe and Brooks being the only one in the home, time continued to go on and law enforcement maintained their perimeter through what was now nighttime, occasionally attempting to communicate with Brooks by telephone. But when this didn't work, they turned things up a notch and pulled out something pretty sweet. An armor-plated 90s police robot with a camera and speaker mounted. The TV segment I got this from clearly shows two different robots. I'm assuming neither of them are the ones that they actually used, but they give you an idea of what this would have looked like.
Andy, this is the police, Andy. Andy, I can stop the robot anytime. Just come to the top of the stairs. The robot's not going to hurt you. Okay? Take control of the robot. All I want you to do is go to the top of the stairs.
The robot goes in and eventually finds him, only now he's being far less coherent. He even shoots the robot a few times without any luck, but after getting backed into a corner, he eventually does shoot the power cord and the machine one more time, totally compromising it. I have to say this, I just can't help but laugh a bit at how weird it would have been for him to see a robot entering his house and backing him into a corner. I know this situation is not funny at all, but this detail kind of is, especially for the time. Like, what would he have been thinking when he saw this? Anyways, with the robot no longer functioning, officers ran out of patience and out of ideas and stormed the residence. And by the time they left, 47-year-old Andrew Brooks Jr. would be deceased, only they weren't the ones to take him out. Fearing the police, this was a decision that he made. At 1:10 p.m. on what was now Monday afternoon, the police officially announced that Andrew Brooks Jr. had been found deceased in an upstairs bedroom of the Gregory home. The approximately 35-hour standoff had finally reached its tragic conclusion. 6 people deceased, if you include Andrew himself, 2 given life-threatening injuries, and 2 freed elderly hostages that were scared for their lives. In the aftermath, police found themselves with virtually no clear motive for the violence that had claimed so many lives. Andrew had no history of serious mental illness, no criminal record, and no known conflicts that might have predicted such devastating actions. Neighbors knew he was crazy. I mean, they called him Crazy Andy, after all, but not that it could get this bad. I did, however, find later reports that say Andrew thought he was dying from a rare blood cancer, so make of that what you will. Nonetheless, this case would leave lasting scars on 2 communities. Little Neck, where the initial violence erupted, and Great Neck, where innocent residents had been terrorized during the prolonged standoff. Rest in peace to all of Andrew's victims, and I hope those whose lives were altered by this man's heinous actions eventually worked through the horrors of their experiences. So guys, I don't usually do this, but I've set a sort of arbitrary goal to hit 100,000 subs by the end of the year. So if you're enjoying this in any way, please consider subscribing. If you're not, it's totally fine, no worries, but you gotta have goals. So yeah, that's my Canadian way of asking you. The story begins on a late January night in 2007. Carl M. Craig, a 58-year-old father and grandfather from Casselberry, Florida, took his family out to dinner at the local IHOP. On this night, 4 generations of the Craig family had actually gathered. There was Carl and his wife, their son Michael and his wife, their 18-year-old daughter, and her infant child. I know that might be a handful to open with, but it's actually pretty simple and it'll make sense as we go on. Like any family trip to a restaurant, this was supposed to be an ordinary, relaxing meal where they spent some time together before heading their separate ways. But very quickly, this particular IHOP location, which is normally safe and quiet at that hour, became very dangerous. At some point while waiting for their food, Michael Craig's daughter, so the 18-year-old who had her infant with her, quickly went outside for a cigarette while letting her mother hold the baby. And again, like everything else on this night, this should have just been a quick thing with no issues. But horribly, while she was out there, 5 masked men approached her, took her hostage, and led her into the restaurant at gunpoint. Everything that happens from this point forward was caught on the IHOP CCTV cameras. As the men enter the building without warning, a few of them immediately surround the worker at the front and begin trying to get money out of the cash register. While this is happening, some of the others head towards the dining area with intentions to rob every customer. They had handguns and one even had a taser. This was all obviously very coordinated and had probably been planned for a period of time. Terrified customers, including the Craig family, obeyed as the robbers began forcing diners to hand over their wallets and belongings. And merely an instant, the restaurant transformed from a place of comfort into a complete nightmare. The men continued to yell and demand that the family hand over their stuff, and many of them obeyed. But as Michael Craig was sitting there watching his daughter be held hostage and his family get their items stolen, it's like something snapped in him. He sprang from his seat and into the group of masked men, attempting to wrestle the gun away. But unfortunately, as a response, the intruders shocked him with their taser. He quickly fell to the ground and was now helpless. And now, 58-year-old Carl Craig, Michael's father, realized just how in danger his loved ones were. Remember, his wife, child, granddaughter, and great-grandchild were all there. So with his heart pounding, he grabbed the nearest object within reach, a child's high chair, and lifted it above his head. He rushed towards the armed men and threw the high chair at the assailants, and this angered them even more. In the frantic struggle, one robber raised his pistol, and he fired straight at poor Carl Craig at point-blank range. This struck Carl in the chest, and he collapsed to the floor. The gunmen did not stay. After a moment of frantic shouting, they fled the scene with their stolen property in a waiting vehicle, leaving behind screaming and confusion. Carl's family members, shaken and in tears, immediately called 911. And seeing the reactions as this was all going down is just very sad. First responders arrived and Carl Craig was rushed to Orlando Regional Medical Center, and you're probably wondering whether or not he made it through. Well, miraculously, doctors found that the bullet had narrowly missed his heart. After emergency surgery and rounds of treatment, Carl's condition was still critical, but stable. And eventually he did recover from this incident, though many were injured and this family in particular was apparently extremely shaken up from this. In the words of an officer who was close to the case, the victims were profoundly impacted by this incident, and understandably so. In the days that followed, Casselberry police combed every surface of the restaurant for evidence. Detectives noted that one of the robbers had dropped a black ski mask at the scene, which was a potential clue for DNA testing. They appealed to the community for any information, but despite these leads, as far as I can see, the identities of these 5 men still remain unknown. In the over 18 years since, no arrests have ever been made. And at the time, friends and neighbors were very outraged that such violence had struck an ordinary family in their own city, so it really does suck that this was never resolved. The aftermath was a blur of pain and disbelief. Carl spent weeks recovering in the hospital, and the family coped with the emotional scars left by the attack. Friends organized meals and fundraisers to support them, and in interviews, Carl and his relatives emphasized how thankful they were that he was alive, but that the whole thing was difficult for them. I'm just happy that everyone made it through, and I hope this family has since been thriving. This was now 18 years ago, and even the infant in the footage would be an adult by now. Also, while I was scripting this, I reached out to my friend who runs the channels Extreme Reality TV and Vintage Videos 2.0 to see if he knew anything more about this or could find anything on it because it's very obscure. And he was able to dig up some really interesting stuff on the Wayback Machine, including the full unedited footage as well as the audio. And I didn't actually know if this full footage was out there, so these will all be included in my list of sources that I put under the video. On February 28, 2023, hundreds of people boarded the Intercity 62 train in Athens, heading to Thessaloniki after a weekend of carnival festivities and that year's Clean Monday. The train carried roughly 350 passengers, and most of them were students in their 20s. This train would not make it to its destination. In fact, it would get in a devastating crash. But before we get into just how bad this was, I'm quickly going to explain Greece's rail system to you because I had no idea just how bad this was. Greece's rail system, which was already outdated but still relatively functional, had deteriorated severely going into the 2010s after the financial crisis, and eventually a now former ruling party signed a very cheap privatization deal that split the railway ownership into two parts. One private side that got to absorb all the profits, and a public side that was now going to go even further into debt, but yet was still responsible for safety and quality assurance, with even less cash and incentive to do so. As a result, funding and staffing were slashed, maintenance deferred, and modernization projects just kept stalling. They even had trains brought in that were known as Horror, the ETR 470, that were scrapped by railways in Switzerland because of how much they broke down and all of the fires that they caused. For all intents and purposes, corruption and systematic mismanagement were massive factors in the crash that we're about to get into. This runs very deep, there's a lot to it, but I'm just trying to summarize it for you as the focus of this entry will be on the crash itself. One example of a delayed project was their planned implementation of the European Train Control System, an automatic braking and signaling system that was supposed to be operational by 2020, but remained uninstalled across Greece by early 2023. This system would have almost certainly prevented what we're going to get into. Rail unions had warned of dangerous conditions for years. In fact, weeks before this crash, the union formally alerted authorities. Like just 21 days before the crash, they said, "We won't wait for the accident which is about to happen to see everyone shed crocodile tears. Safety should be on the front line." This is a very eerie prediction in hindsight, especially considering how close to the accident it was. The EU had even taken Greece to court for failing to establish the required independent accident investigation body. The warnings also went unheeded. And finally, just to give you an idea of how outdated their rail system was, and still is, staff worked with equipment from the 1970s. There was no digital traffic control. Almost everything was done on handheld radios and paper, meaning it was mostly human dependent. Malfunctioning signals were so common that operators and controllers learned to distrust red lights. At Larissa Station, a critical junction and a key location in today's entry, the traffic control panel was so convoluted that even the most experienced operators struggled with it. And on the night of the accident, February 28, 2023, a 59-year-old station master was alone on his 5th consecutive overnight shift at Larissa Station. He had been appointed just 6 weeks earlier after minimal training and was in charge of traffic control for a very large area. IC62 was already running 48 minutes late due to electrical faults, and at around 11 p.m., it arrived at this station, Larissa Station, where this 59-year-old station master needed to manually switch the tracks, and while exhausted and confused, he incorrectly set the switches. He radioed the operator that it was clear to proceed, believing the train was on the correct track, but in reality, it remained on the southbound line when it was about to head north, aimed directly at an oncoming freight train 63503, which he also incorrectly wrote down as the train that had just arrived. The operator questioned the order but eventually complied, and now for 12 minutes, two trains hurtled at each other at a combined closing speed of roughly 240 kilometers an hour, or 150 miles per hour. Neither crew received any warning until the final seconds, and at approximately 11:20 p.m., they collided in the Tempi area. The passenger locomotive was obliterated on impact. The first passenger car derailed and toppled, then the dining car plowed into the freight train's cargo of steel plates, folding into a severe S-shape. A massive fireball erupted as damaged overhead wires ignited fuel or transformer oil, reaching temperatures of above 1,300 degrees Celsius. These first two passenger cars were subsequently engulfed in flames, and in total, 57 people lost their lives and 180 were injured. Remember, this is full of mostly young students. Audio recordings even captured some passengers' final moments, and I've obtained one of them, but because of the nature of it, I'm only going to show you a small, less intense segment of it. Not even because of guidelines, it's just it doesn't feel right. But just a fair warning, the following audio may be rough for some audiences. I just want to give you an idea.
9 και γεωγραφικό μήκος 22,476 με εκτιμόμενη ακτίνα αναζήτησης 9.297 μέτρων. Αυτό το μήνυμα θα επαναληφθεί σε 5 δευτερόλεπτα.
Με ακούτε.
Forensic investigators concluded that roughly 30 victims survived the initial crash itself, only to succumb to the fire or smoke. Survivors in rear cars described their horror as coaches spun and flipped, and they smashed windows, jumped into the darkness, and ran from the spreading fire. Some had been seated in that dining car minutes earlier, but moved. It's a decision that saved their lives, but left them with guilt. The fires were so intense that rescuers couldn't approach for nearly an hour, and the rescue effort lasted 3 days, involving 150 firefighters and 40 ambulances. 32 victims could only be identified through DNA testing, and one 23-year-old student was never recovered at all. Not a single trace of her remained, despite extensive searches with cadaver dogs. She was declared deceased with nothing returned to her family. At the Larissa Hospital morgue, families waited in anguish. Some parents begged to identify their children by sight, only to learn the fire had made recognition impossible. They gave DNA samples and endured agonizing waits for results. One mother later discovered authorities had disposed of remains without informing families. The railway company, staying true to their horrible track record, provided almost no information, leaving many desperate relatives to make frantic, unanswered calls. Quickly, authorities detained the 59-year-old Larissa station master and charged him with negligent homicide, but a 178-page official report issued in 2025 revealed the catastrophe's roots ran far deeper, which I already explained. He was 6 weeks into his role that carried a ton of responsibility. He was 59, and they were severely understaffed. An accident was already inevitable. As you could expect, the report also only further confirmed that Greece's railway still lacked basic safety systems that would have prevented the collision, both in 2023 and today. The outrage as a result of this was understandably gigantic. There were many protests with tens of thousands of people. The transport minister resigned 2 days after the crash, admitting failure to modernize the railways, then stood for re-election 2 months later and won in June, triggering fresh protests. The prime minister initially called it tragic human error, sparking outrage, but 5 days later, he acknowledged that it was inconceivable that 2 trains could be on the same track without intervention. And yeah, the people had every single right to be infuriated. Officials hastily cleaned the crash site, excavating 750 cubic meters of soil and clearing wreckage before full forensic study. Remains and debris were removed without proper documentation, pieces weren't numbered, photographed, or geotagged, and fragments reemerged 2 years later showing signs of tampering. And remember, the EU had already taken them to court for this sort of thing. When families hired specialists to search months later, they found additional remains that had been missed. The official report acknowledged that pressure to clear the site caused loss of evidentiary material, and in early 2025, the Deputy Minister for Civil Protection resigned amid allegations that he ordered early debris removal and evidence destruction. By then, the majority of the Greek people had already believed there had been some deliberate cover-up. Independent experts also found traces of xylene, suggesting the freight train may have been secretly carrying hazardous cargo. Rallies and memorials under the slogan, "This crime will not be forgotten," were held, and the phrase, "Text me when you arrive," became a powerful symbol on protest banners and memorial speeches. As of February 2025, 36 individuals awaited a trial set for March 2026. 33 faced charges carrying potential life sentences, and despite thousands of pages of evidence, promised safety reforms still remain largely unimplemented. The European train control system still isn't fully operational. Near misses have continued through 2024 and 2025. And yeah, it's just absolutely unacceptable and extremely heartbreaking. More than 2 years on, the victims' families remain determined. They fight not only for memory, but for true accountability and change. And some parents even quit their jobs to campaign full-time. They file petitions with European Parliament and vow to take their case to the European Court of Human Rights if necessary. Rest in peace to the 57 lives taken on this fateful night, and my heart is with the thousands of other family members and Greek people who have been affected by this in any capacity.